In 1848, when Karl Marx wrote the Communist Manifesto, his opening lines to that were, "The history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggle." He went on from that to argue that the basic division in society is a class division between what he called the bourgeoisie, who were the rulers, and what he called the proletariat, who were the working class. Now, up until 1871, the year of the Paris Commune, workers had always fought, but they had never actually taken power. And then suddenly, on the 28th of March, 1871, the workers of Paris fought and declared the Commune. The Parisian workers expelled the bourgeoisie from the city, and they took power. And in doing this, they set about trying to form an entirely new form of social order, an entirely new society. The first proclamation of the Paris Commune on the 18th of March, 1871, really spells out, I think, clearly what this was meant to be about. It stated, "The proletariat of Paris, amidst the failures and treasons of the ruling class, have understood that the hour has struck for them to save the situation by taking into their own hands the direction of public affairs. They have understood that it is their imperious duty and their absolute right to render themselves masters of their own destinies by seizing upon the governmental power." Now, for 2 months, 2 glorious months, they achieved what we are told even today under Blair is impossible to achieve. In other words, they ran their own lives. Now, the Commune was to last only 72 days, but what an incredible 72 days it was. And I think that what I want to do in this talk is really spell out what happened in 1871 in Paris in terms of the Commune, and really to argue that although it was something that happened over 126 years ago, and although it was something which tragically was brutally crushed, the lessons and the experience of the Parisian workers and of the Commune remain tremendously inspirational for all of us today. Now, the origins of the Paris Commune lay very much in the decaying Second Republic of Emperor Louis Napoleon, and he really attempted to build his empire on the backs of the 1848 uprisings, and he did this through a mixture of financial chicanery and grandeur. He really wanted to model himself on Napoleon I, and basically what he headed right across France was essentially a very decadent and very repressive regime. In many ways, the seeds of discontent and revolt lay in the regime's decadence. It was a regime that was characterized by rapid economic prosperity, by rapid industrial growth, which led at that time to an increasing of the size of the working class. But also at the same time, from the point of view of the rulers of French society, it also led to them flaunting their own wealth, particularly in the face of poverty and misery amongst the masses. Now, the Second Empire of Louis Napoleon was basically a society of unimagined wealth and luxury. It was a society characterized by lavish balls, by lavish hunting parties, and what have you. Everything inside that Second Empire was designed basically for the convenience of the rich. I mean, if you really want to get an inkling of how bone idle the rich in our society are, they even had a newspaper in the Second Empire that was made out of rubber, so that the idle rich could wallow in the bath whilst they were reading their paper. That's the kind of society that this was, and the greed and the hedonism of the established elite contrasted very, very sharply with what the harshness of life was like for the Parisian working class. And in Paris at that time, over half of the population lived in poverty, basically bordering on destitution. And this particular society was summed up by Frederick Engels when he described the Second Empire as the exploitation of France by a gang of political and financial adventurers using corruption and mass thievery. Now, the resentment and the bitterness of the Parisians did not go unheeded. It essentially found a voice in the organisations and the clubs, particularly the working class clubs that started to spring up in 1868. Now, in an attempt to appease the workers, in an attempt to see off discontent and what have you, the regime granted a series of limited reforms. So they said that there could be public meetings. They had that people had a right to form unions and also a right to go out on strike. But the key thing that united the ordinary masses in Paris at the time was their complete and utter hatred of the regime. And basically, the regime and the rulers of that regime, like all rulers all over the world, being very cocky, being carried away by their own sense of self-importance and their own rhetoric, Louis Napoleon embarked upon the Franco-Prussian War in 1870. And of course, because he was cocky and because he felt confident, he sent the French troops to Sedan, where basically he expected to have a very, very quick victory over Bismarck. But instead, he suffered a humiliating defeat at the hand of Prussia. And Louis Napoleon was captured. Now, this precipitated the collapse of the Second Empire. It basically fell like a pack of cards. And as a result of this, Louis Napoleon was forced to abdicate. On the 1st of September 1870, the French army surrendered. And at the time that they surrendered, Paris rose up to proclaim the Republic. Now, the Republican forces that came to power in the elections that took place immediately after that was headed by a man called Trochu. Now, Trochu was basically a man who secretly wanted to do a deal. He wanted to make peace with Bismarck and the Prussian army. But what prevented him from doing this was the pressure that was building up from below by the masses in Paris. Now, all of Paris hailed the passing of Louis Napoleon. They all hoped that the war would end, but of course the war didn't end because the Prussian army was at the gates of Paris, and whilst they were at the gates of Paris, the workers decided that they were going to take the defence of the city into their own hands. They said that everyone who was capable of bearing arms should be enrolled into the National Guard. The National Guard began to be turned into a civilian militia. It was forced to include artisans and workers. And this civilian militia started to swell to 350,000 people. They actually started to go about electing their own officers. Now, this, of course, was much to the chagrin of the bourgeoisie. There was one bourgeois man who actually complained that he had to take orders from the butler of all people. He couldn't understand why he should have to do this. But anyway, so much for him. Now, for our bourgeois rulers, the people of Paris proved to be a far greater problem than basically the invading Prussian army. And as Marx said, Paris armed was the revolution armed. Now, in September 1870, the siege of Paris begins. Now, no one expected this siege, and no one expected it to last as long as it did, which was 5 months. Now, the result of the siege was not that people felt that they'd been battered and they couldn't fight back. It actually led to the reverse. It intensified debate within the working class clubs about who could best defend Paris. Was it going to be the bourgeois rulers behind Trochu, or was it going to have to be the proletariat? The siege also started to bring the real class divisions within Paris to the fore, making it very, very clear that the bourgeoisie, as far as they were concerned, they wanted and they preferred misery and hardship for the masses in order to dampen the spirit of the Parisian masses, as well as far as they were concerned, they saw in the siege an opportunity to make a fast buck. I mean, there's one absolutely incredible, barbaric story of an opportunist estate agent, and you can see how nasty they were even back in the 19th century, advertising the siege as a way of attracting tourists. And they put up this leaflet saying, "Notice for the benefit of English gentlemen wishing to attend the Paris siege. Comfortable apartments, completely shell-proof, rooms and basement for impressionable persons." Yeah, this is what estate agents were like then, and it's obvious that they haven't changed that much today. So instead of the population of Paris being 500,000 and having 500,000 mouths to feed, the population of Paris began to swell to 2 million. Things such as food and fuel started to run out, and rationing was introduced. But of course, not until the speculators, the black marketeers, and what have you, had had their day. And so therefore prices were artificially inflated, so it meant that basic necessities such as food were beyond the reach of ordinary Parisians. The situation was so desperate, and I don't particularly want to offend any vegetarians in the room, but the situation was so desperate that during that time a total of 65,000 horses were eaten, 5,000 cats, 12,000 dogs, as well as a variety of 200 other odd animals and birds and rats. Now, of course, as is usual in any crisis, it wasn't our rulers that had to pay for this. It was the workers who had to bear the brunt of the misery of this particular sort of society. Now, even in that situation, rats became a delicacy. They became a delicacy just for the well-off. Milk rations were introduced, and eventually even milk rations began to dry up. In December 1870, there were daily convoys of baby coffins being taken across to the cemetery in Père Lachaise. You had the situation where poor Parisians, particularly children and young women, were suffering the most. You had the most horrible situation of young girls prostituting themselves for a piece of crust. They would actually go to the restaurateurs and sell their ration cards in order to survive. And of course you had the horrific spread of epidemics and disease, which was absolutely rife. In 1 week of November alone, smallpox had claimed over 500 victims, and that was the kind of situation that the Parisians found themselves in. Now, of course, that's what it was like for the masses. Well, what was life like for the bourgeoisie? In contrast to this misery, the rich hardly suffered at all. One commentator actually turned around and said that the siege was an inconvenience for the rich, but it was never real hardship or hunger. They were still eating roast beef and plenty of it. They still had poultry. They still had rabbits. So it was obvious that they weren't suffering at all. And towards the end of the siege, an even more insidious man than Trochu took over the government. His name was Adolphe Thiers, and he was to make his name later on as the butcher of Paris. Now, Karl Marx described Thiers as a monstrous gnome. He said he was consistent only in his greed for wealth and hatred for the men who produced it. Now, Thiers attacked Paris and what was happening inside Paris. He said it was ruled by convicts. As far as he was concerned, the very existence of the Paris Commune was an offence to him. Now, he immediately signed a peace treaty with Prussia. And basically this peace treaty, as you can imagine, amounted to a stab in the back for the suffering of the Parisian workers. And to add insult to injury, of course, it was workers, as I said before, that had to pay for this ruling class crisis. So the government declared that all debts that had been incurred during the siege had to be paid within 48 hours in total. They also declared that landlords were to be given the right to demand back pay on rent that had not been paid during the siege, and also the daily pay of the National Guard. And remember, the National Guard was changing into a civilian militia, which only amounted to 1.5 francs a day, was to be stopped completely. So in other words, it was ordinary people that were going to suffer, not the landlords, not the speculators, and certainly not the bourgeois rulers, and certainly not Adolphe Thiers. Now, all this was a massive blow to the working class of Paris. But they remained resolute. Their mood actually started to harden the longer than this went on, because as far as they were concerned, they saw the peace terms that Thiers signed as a complete and utter betrayal, and they decided to take the defence of Paris into their own hands. And what they did, they got this huge cannon and other guns, and they took it to Montmartre. Those of you that have been to Paris, you know how high it is. They took it to the heights of Montmartre, which was the centre of the working class district. Now, this brought the Parisian masses into direct confrontation with Thiers, and basically the stage was set for the civil war. Now, Thiers initiated this war. He initiated it on the 18th of March 1871. He was so scornful of the Parisian masses that he was absolutely convinced he would get a quick victory. But of course it wasn't to be a quick victory. There's another very, very funny and very famous story. It's about how the Thiers regime sent 6,000 troops into the working class district of Montmartre in order to capture the entire arsenal. What happened was that the soldiers they crept into Paris whilst it was dark, whilst Paris was sleeping, hoping to take the cannons away so nobody would notice. When they got there, they suddenly realised that they'd forgotten to bring the horses with them. Now, this is the sort of thing you imagine in a Monty Python sketch and what have you. Now, when Paris wakes up, they find that they are surrounded by these soldiers who apparently are still waiting for the horses to arrive. I mean, you'd think they'd use a bit of nous and actually go out and get them, but they didn't. Now, the response to what happened was absolutely immediate. A man called Lissagheri, who was a journalist and also a communard, who survived to write a brilliant book about the Paris Commune, described what happened next. He said that as in our great days, the women were the first to act. Those of the 18th of March, who were hardened by the siege, they had had a double ration of misery. They did not wait for the men. They surrounded the machine guns, saying, "This is shameful. What are you doing here?" The soldiers did not answer, only occasionally saying, "Oh, come, my good woman, get out of the way." There was one woman, a very, very brave woman, called Louise Michel, who was a leading communard. She came running up the hill with 200 other women, and they were armed with rifles. And she was absolutely crucial to arguing with the soldiers who were there to come over to the side of the people. On 3 separate occasions, the general at that time, General Lecomte, ordered his troops to fire on these women so that they could go off with the guns. On 3 occasions, the soldiers refused to fire. And finally, the officers turned around and called mutiny. They reversed their guns and they fired on their officers, much to the joy of the Parisian women, and people started chanting, "Down with tears, down with tears." Now, of course, the ruling class panicked. They didn't expect this because they were so cocky. They thought they'd get away with it. And what they did was to retreat to Versailles and with their National Assembly, swearing revenge on the Parisian masses. And it was absolutely incredible because almost by accident, if you like, and without meaning to, Paris was suddenly in the hands of the masses. Now, there were all sorts of things that the Commune was responsible for instigating, and many of the things that they did instigate were very, very positive indeed. So they set about forming a society that was based upon open democracy. They had elections that were based upon universal suffrage. They had workers' reps that were elected, and these reps were going to be subjected to direct recall of the electorate. They were not going to wait every 4 or 5 years, as we have to do at present. They were going to make sure that the democracy was direct and that they could recall their representatives. They also reached decisions democratically. They decided that the highest salary should not exceed 6,000 francs, and that it should be for the same for absolutely everybody. And that, as far as they were concerned, was going to prevent people from going into career politicians and what have you. They also elected all administrative personnel, the judiciary, in education, and all the administrative posts and what have you. And it's very interesting because Engels, when he's looking at what happened to the Paris Commune, he actually commented how it was at this point that the class character of the Commune began to emerge very, very sharply and very, very clearly. It was also something that was acknowledged by Lenin, who saw, when he looked back at the history of the Paris Commune, he saw that this form of government was a decisive break from all forms of bourgeois democracy that had existed before. The Commune went even further in the decrees that it passed. It separated the role of the church from the state. So they abolished all state payments to the church. They confiscated all church property for the masses, and they set about removing all religious symbols, religious dogmas, and what have you from all public places, particularly in the education system. The Commune was also very, very internationalist in character. They had Polish and German representatives in the government because, as far as they were concerned, the flag of the Commune was the flag of the World Republic. They also abolished conscription and the standing army. Instead, they had the workers' militia, where every single citizen who was fit enough to was encouraged to enroll as a National Guard. And even before the idea of the welfare state had ever been conceived of in Western society, the Paris Commune officially adopted all widows and children, including every single illegitimate child. They granted pensions of 600 francs to to all widows. They also granted 300 francs to every single child, and also granted free education to every single child. They granted pensioners 100 to 500 francs, and also to dependents. Now you contrast this sense of humanity back in 1871 with the barbarity of the man who thinks the unthinkable, Frank Field, that we are told about, or the barbarity of people like Jack Straw, who would have us lock away 10-year-olds because they are somehow a danger to freedom as we know it, and what have you. They also opened up all the factories that had previously been closed by the bosses during the siege, and they turned the running of these factories over to the employees who were in them, and they set about plans to form one big union. They abolished night shifts inside bakeries, which is a really hated feature of the old order. They also set up a commission of labour, which was designed to curb the worst excesses of capitalism. They revoked the Hated Maturities Act, which basically meant that rents and evictions were made illegal, and they started to make inroads into the power of landlords. They also tore down the militaristic monuments, the thing called the Place Vendôme, which was essentially a victory column. It was a symbol of chauvinism and of empire, and it was torn down to much popular acclaim. Again, the prisoners of war that they had, they didn't shoot them. They actually, they were prisoners of war, and they kept them alive. They actually did away with the guillotine. They publicly burnt the guillotine to popular acclaim. They also closed down pawn shops. Now, this wasn't out of any kind of puritanical zeal, but they shut down pawn shops, and they said that gambling should be banned because basically it was based upon the private exploitation of the poorest people in society, and they felt that this went against the spirit of what the commune should be about. They also had another decree, which is my personal favourite, which is that they said that Parisians should not relieve themselves in public. They should only relieve themselves in public urinals. And I'm sure that many people would welcome something like that. They even provided a special facility to the Times correspondent. And this is absolutely incredible, because the Times correspondent, who was in Paris at that time, in page after page, continually denounced the Parisian masses as being uncouth, drunkard, and lacking intelligence, and yet the Parisians actually provided a special facility to him. Now, all this, as you can imagine, sent tears and the National Assembly absolutely bananas. All talk of reconciliation was completely and utterly out. As far as Thiers was concerned, he said, "We will not negotiate with assassins." Now, this is very interesting, of course, because Thiers and the French ruling class never talked about Bismarck or Prussia in these terms, and yet here they were attacking the masses as being assassins. And despite this, however, in Paris itself, there was complete and utter jubilation at the sort of society that they were trying to set about. There was a real sense of what Lenin called the festival of the oppressed. Crime and violence suddenly became a thing of the past. There was a real flourishing of debate that took place, an argument amongst the working class about what kind of society they wanted. There was a real blossoming of humanity, and as Lenin put it himself, he said, "Every cook shall govern, not just the chosen few." That is what the Parisian masses set about trying to create. Now, having said that, tragically, not everything was rosy in the garden, and unfortunately, despite the fact that it was workers that tried to create this sort of society, there were contradictions within what they were trying to do. Because in the workers' organisation at the time, it was dominated by two forces. You had what were called the Blanquists and the Proudhonists. The Blanquists were the people who looked back to the revolutions of 1793. What they essentially argued was that you could seize control by a small group of very heroic and committed individuals, and unfortunately they had no conception of mass involvement or of economic questions at all. On the other hand, you had the Proudhonists. Now, what the Proudhonists wanted was basically a society based upon smallholders, of artisans and workers. They were completely mistrustful of any sense of organisation or association, and they had no conception of wider political questions. So tragically, within the workers' organisations, on the committees of the Commune, these were the two forces that dominated. Now, consequently, as a result of this, they made huge mistakes. And I'll just go through them. One of the mistakes that they made was that they didn't advance upon Versailles. Thiers had taken the National Assembly to Versailles. The Parisians did not go anywhere near that. There were huge debates that raged within the Commune and the committees of the Commune about what they should do about this, but they decided not to act. Their passivity and their indecision was going to be absolutely fatal, because as Trotsky said, the national government could have been smashed and all of them arrested and no one would have objected, but unfortunately this didn't happen. They also continued to let the Bank of France operate, and because the Bank of France continued to operate, they sent out money out of Paris for Thiers, and Thiers therefore was allowed to buy weapons. If the assets had been seized of the Bank of France, then who knows what could have happened. Maybe the bourgeoisie would have put pressure on Thiers to actually settle for peace or whatever. Because Engels recognized what a serious political mistake this was on the part of the Commune when he said, almost like the genital organs of the bourgeoisie, squeezing the financial assets of the rich would really have hurt them. But unfortunately, this was not to be the case. Another mistake that they made was that they actually didn't go far enough on the inroads on capitalism. They were absolutely obsessed with elections and indecision. They had elections, but they were based upon geographical areas. They weren't based upon workplaces. And worse than that, they actually hoped and believed that Thiers would actually respect the legality of the Paris Commune, and they could not have been more naive in this belief, because when the attack came, the response of the communards, unlike before when the soldiers tried to retrieve the guns, was that they hesitated because they were so shocked, they were so horrified at what was happening, they could not believe this. And tragically, as Lenin pointed out, they allowed Thiers 13 days in order to regroup and reorganize through the Friends of the Order and also with the help of the Prussians. And those 13 days were to prove to be absolutely crucial, because when the smashing of the Paris Commune came, it was absolutely brutal, and it was a bloodbath. It began on the 21st of May in 1871. And what followed in those 7 days from the 21st of May was complete and utter savagery that really showed the real nature of the bourgeois class. Thiers turned around and said, "I shall be pitiless." And pitiless he was true to his word. The bloodbath that ensued claimed, and this is a conservative estimate, 20,000 to 30,000 lives of communards. Men, women and children were just put up against the walls and shot at random. Even prisoners that were taken were not looked after. They were left without food, they were left without water, to literally rot and to die. Paris literally was littered with corpses. After every single shooting that took place, the bourgeoisie would chant, "Encore, encore." We wanted more and more. The monstrosity of the bourgeoisie could be seen very clearly in one particular incident that took place. A man called Fouron, who was a leading communard, he had been arrested, and he'd had his head cut into two. Now his head was taken and paraded inside the courts at Versailles, and you had you had these elegant ladies, these elegant bourgeois ladies, who were going around prodding his skull with their equally elegant parasols. And this is what the bourgeoisie are like. And even bourgeois commentators who up until then had totally backed Thiers, had said that what the communards were doing was completely outrageous, could not stomach this any longer. That same Times correspondent who described the Parisian masses as being uncouth, uneducated and what have you, suddenly changed his tune after he saw the bloodbath. He said, as many as 1,000 communists were shot after their capture. Human life has become so cheap that a man is shot more readily than a dog. Now, when the smashing of this commune came, for Thiers, the smashing of it and the destroying of it was not enough. People were encouraged to identify the leading members of the communards. You had an officer called Galifet, who was a complete and utter animal. He turned around and said, "You people of Montmartre may think me cruel, but I am even crueler than you imagine." He randomly went around shooting people on his own personal whim. When our rulers talk about terror, they always talk about red terror. They always talk about the terror of the extremists, of the revolutionaries. They talk about the terror of the Russian Revolution or of the French Revolution. But the terror even of the French Revolution pales into complete and utter insignificance in comparison to the massacres and the bloodbath that we saw in Paris in 1871. And the heroism of the working class, despite their lack of organisation, was absolutely tremendous. Despite all the odds, the Parisian masses fought to defend Paris street by street, barricade by barricade, trying to halt the advances of the bourgeoisie. And of course, they weren't helped in this by the Prussian army. It's actually very ironic because Versailles was hell-bent originally on revenge against Bismarck for their defeat at Sedan. But suddenly, of course, Thiers realised that the enemy within was far, far a greater threat than the Parisians. So Versailles actually did a deal with Prussia, which meant that Bismarck released all French prisoners that his army held. They also allowed the Versailles troops to march through Prussian occupied territory, and literally they helped in the bombardment of Paris. The Prussian troops themselves, actually 10,000 of them, were sent to one front of Paris to prevent the Parisian masses from escaping as Thiers and his forces were rolling through Paris, shooting everything in sight. They had a hand in this bloodbath every bit as much as Thiers did. And again, Thiers and people like that have always talked about the Red Scare. They've always said, Karl Marx and the International were really behind this. And this actually isn't true, because when it actually came to the committee of the Paris Commune, out of a committee of 90 people, there were only 20 members of the International. And it's also very interesting because when the Commune started to occur, Marx himself actually had very little influence on this. He was actually very surprised and taken aback at the spontaneity of the working class. Originally, he thought that the Parisian masses were wrong to really go for victory. He didn't believe that they could do it. But of course, as he saw events unfold, not only was he taken aback with their spontaneity, but he absolutely welcomed it, because he said it was the working classes storming heaven. Now, when Marx wrote his thesis on the Civil War, he actually wrote it during the bloody week of late May. He enthusiastically backed the revolutionary initiative of the working class, and also when the Commune was crushed in the manner that it was, Marx was the only person who provided both the political defence of what the Parisian masses had done, as well as providing some kind of theoretical analysis as to its weaknesses. He pointed to the heroism of the working classes in terms of rejecting bourgeois society, but he also pointed out the limitations and the weaknesses in the sense that they didn't actually go about smashing that bourgeois state. Because as he says in his thesis and in the Communist Manifesto, one thing was proved by the Commune, that the working class cannot simply lay hold of the ready-made state machinery and wield it for its own purposes. Instead, it has to be smashed and destroyed in all its manifestations. Now, I think when we think back to the defeat of the Parisian workers, Trotsky himself recognized what a huge defeat it was, how it set back the French working class by many, many decades. But Trotsky also turned around and said, but you have to look to the heroism, because it wasn't the heroism that the Parisian masses lacked. What they lacked was a clear strategy and central organization. So I think in concluding, what we have to say is that the Paris Commune is part of our history. It is part of our tradition. It is part and parcel of the history and tradition of ordinary working class people taking power into their own hands and trying to shape and change society in their own images for the benefit of everybody. And therefore we have to celebrate it as the first time that workers actually set about trying to take power. The tremendous courage of the communards against all odds was absolutely inspiring, because for a few short weeks they actually achieved something that we're told you can't do. The whole might of the French state was paralyzed, it was passive, it was indecisive, they did not know what to do. And the Paris Commune, even more than that, gives us today a glimpse of what life could be like when workers try to set about taking control of their own lives. And so therefore the experience of the Commune, as well as the errors, are very, very important to our tradition. Lenin studied the Commune right up until the October Revolution. He read every single thing that was written about it because he wanted to apply the lessons of that to October 1917. And in the Marxist tradition, we have this saying, which is that the Revolutionary Party has to be the memory of the class, and it certainly does. And so therefore, for us, we have to salute the heroism and the spontaneity of the Parisian workers. But we also owe it to ourselves and to future generations of socialists not to repeat the mistakes that they have made. And I will just end by reading a quote from Trotsky, which he wrote about the Parisian masses in New York in March 1917. He had this to say: "Remember the Commune. We socialists will say to the insurgent workers' masses, the bourgeoisie has armed you against an external enemy. Refuse to return your weapons like the Parisian workers refused in 1871. Heed the appeal of Karl Liebknecht and turn these weapons against your real enemy, against capitalism. Tear the state machinery from their hands. Transform it from the instrument of bourgeois oppression into an apparatus of proletarian self-rule. Today you are infinitely more powerful than were your forefathers in the epoch of the Commune. Tumble all you parasites from their thrones. Seize the land, the mines and the factories for your own use. Fraternity in labour, equality in enjoying the fruits of labour. The banner of the Commune is the banner of the World Republic of Labour, and that's what we should remember."
Right, if people would like to make contributions or ask questions, if you can indicate by putting your hand up, and I'll call people two at a time. And what you've got 3 minutes to speak at the mic at the front, and I'll tap on my mic after 2 minutes to tell you to start to sum up. So who's going to go first?
Yeah, one of the very first things I ever did when I sort of started getting interested in politics was I translated a play by Bertolt Brecht called The Days of the Commune. I don't know anything about the Commune, but it's absolutely shone out from this play, which I don't know if it's ever staged. Perhaps it's difficult to stage because it's sort of really a sort of political statement. I don't know. But what shines out absolutely clearly from it is the role of the women in the Paris Commune. They were really, really crucial. And I think as a sort of following on from that, the women soldiers, Louise Michel and so on, I suppose they must have been part of the citizens' militia. I'm sort of assuming, I always assumed that, but I hope I haven't got it wrong anyway. But if anyone ever thinks that all women have some kind of thing in common that they can fight for as women against men, the story of the Paris Commune absolutely gives the lie to it, because the women in the aristocracy who came along afterwards when the Commune had been smashed, I mean, they were absolutely disgusting. They were like coming along behind when it had all been sort of smashed into the ground, like real nasty little spiteful cowards, prodding everybody with their umbrellas. And actually, not just with umbrellas, I mean, they were willing to shoot them and run swords through them and saying, there, no, you know. So women and men together, that's absolutely clear.
Yeah, I was actually in Paris in December on Montmartre. Very, very pleasant place to be. But, I actually looked inside the Sacré-Cœur, the great church on top of Montmartre, which dominates Paris, great, beautiful, white, shining edifice. And I checked the inscription inside. It was the first time I'd realised that the Sacré-Cœur was actually started to be built immediately in the aftermath of the Commune. And the inscription read in French something along the lines of for the people of Paris and the awe of God. And it's quite clear that having smashed the workers of Paris, the intention of the rulers was to build this edifice of religion to further enslave the masses by enthrallment of the mystique of God, and keep them down any method. Shoot them, then you get them to believe in religion. I think that's a really clear indication, right, of how our attitude should be to religion.
Thinking about monuments, and if you go to Paris, there is in fact a monument to the Commune on the walls of the Père Lachaise cemetery, and the Commune has been an inspiration to the working class movement in France and abroad throughout the world. One of the things we mentioned earlier, because there are all sorts of stories about the Commune, and I was interested in the one about food, because I'd heard another one that during the siege, not only did people eat rats, but because the bourgeoisie, they wanted to carry on life as usual, and they'd go out to these big posh restaurants, and the only thing they couldn't get was fresh seafood. So instead they actually raided the zoo in Paris, and I think they killed elephants and hippopotamus and all sorts of things like that. Continue on the line of an inspiration for comrades who go to Paris. I mean, there is a restaurant in the northern working class quartier of Paris that has a superb fresco on one wall, and it's a barricade with Louise Michel on the barricade with a rifle. Fantastic place to have a meal.
There's an urgent message for Louisa Williams, if she's in the room, to contact the problems desk in Ulu.
It's not just the church that's a tribute to the Commune, it's the whole design of Paris. The fact that they've got those wide boulevards, Paris was redesigned with big wide boulevards so that you had a clear field of fire, so that you couldn't build barricades street by street to defend the city in the future. So that's what you get.
We go back to the lessons of history. Now, I went to school learning history. It took me years to remember JFK got shot. I still don't know now, actually. He's 63 something. But when I first read about the Paris Commune, I thought, shit, that's great. I remembered it. It's stuck in my mind since I joined the SWP. So, it proves that it's people that write history, not the kings of things, presidents and pricks, basically. And the other thing is that also at the time, Bakunin, the anarchist Bakunin, when the Paris Commune went on, when it has actually happened, he ran up to the council house in Lyon and held that France is in anarchy, only to be arrested by 2 policemen. So, and again, it's important that we understand that the Paris Commune and tell the truth, tell this is our history, and not like anarchists who ignore the past and basically carry on fighting the class struggle on their terms. Last thing I want to point out is, again, about Thiers. My girlfriend lives in France, and I visit Dijon. I was absolutely disgusted to see in Dijon Thiers Boulevard. It's like you get to Germany, there's like Adolf Hitler's Strasse or something. It's like, this guy's a masculine bastard, and they've got like a street name's named after him. It's like unbelievable.
Has anyone got any questions they'd like to ask? The speakers come back on. Could people come to the front because we're taking the lead?
as I understand it as well, there were other cities in France who which tried to establish communes. I know, for example, in Bordeaux and Grenoble, there were at least attempts, and Lyon as well. I wonder if you've got any more information on how successful, well, they weren't successful, as successful, but how long-lasting they were.
Anyone else want to come in and try and answer them?
I think one of the most interesting things about learning, giving a realistic appraisal of the achievements and the limitations of the commune, is the whole thing about the relationship between the politics and the economics within the commune at the time. One of the things that Talat talks about in terms was the whole thing about the obsession with elections and the problem with the workplaces. Because whilst they gave power over to the workers in the sense of, to give the workers had the workplaces, that wasn't the organisational base of the commune. In the sense that it wasn't, unlike Russia in 1917, where, for instance, Lenin, as the Russian Revolution progresses in 1917, Lenin doesn't talk about the Soviets in terms of we needed to win power solely in the Soviets. Lenin makes an increasing emphasis throughout the Russian Revolution in 1917 upon the factory committees, and upon Bolsheviks actually winning power in the factory committees and actually winning the elections in the factory committees, where real power was. The real power was actually in the factories. That was where the economic clout of the workers was, where the political clout of the workers was, and that was the basis on which they could begin to reorganise things. And that was the strategy that the Bolsheviks took. That actually began to secure fruits like by September 1917. They actually become the majority in the Soviets as well, because the Soviets were built off the backs of the mass meetings that were built by the factory committees. And I think that's one of the most important things about the lessons of the Paris Commune, because one of the things that we are persistently given in Britain, and that we're persistently given actually in France and places like that now increasingly, is this apparent differentiation between politics and economics, between what happens in the workplace and the political issues. And the reality is that in a great social crisis, they fuse. And they fuse absolutely. So in every workplace, you find that political issues are raised, that there's a political battle going on, and that that political battle needs to be won. But you also find that actually you can't solve political problems solely by political responses. You need to have economic power.
It's a question that I hope that you didn't cover prior to my late arrival, which I apologise for. We're talking, the comrade, previously about the role of the working class, and my question is, maybe reflects my own lack of knowledge about the Paris Commune, and it was a very thorough and extensive analysis you gave, which I commend. But my question is that the Putilov works, for example, in Petrograd had 40,000 workers. The Russian working class, although it was 4 million, was a minority, but was concentrated in very large establishments. Is it correct that in Paris, for example, or in France, like a large workplace was 20 or 30, and an average workplace was 6? And in the context of workplaces of 6 or 20, how does this fit into our analysis of the working class?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask a question. I know that the women were on the forefront of fighting in the Paris Commune, but am I right in saying that they didn't have the vote in the Paris Commune? There was universal suffrage, but I don't believe that women had the vote in the Commune. I think this is a contradiction if women were at the forefront in fighting. Can you explain that contradiction?
Yeah, I just wanted to come back on the movement spreading around France, because there was actually spontaneous uprisings in most of the built-up towns and cities, the ports, the mines, across the whole of France. But it was a question of leadership inside the class. You see, the political parties, as has been said, were built around anarchist ideas. And instead of centralising their power at the moment when they needed to be at their strongest, they devolved power. And so instead of, you'd have one street where it would be like, autonomy for the houses, when really you needed to concentrate the entire force of the class. And this continued through the entire struggle. There'd be different moments in the struggle of the commune where entire sections of the class would rise up. There was fantastic sabotage, trains just would never turn up with guns at Versailles. And this went on everywhere, but the problem was there was nobody concentrating this power. People were never sent from the commune to the towns, to the mines, to the docks, saying, well, let's pull together. You've got ships full of guns, we've got hundreds of people needing guns, You've got food, we got coal, whatever. And this didn't happen, and this was one of the many mistakes. I mean, it's easy for us to obviously stand here and say we got it all wrong, but, this was the first time in history that the unwashed rose up and actually took control of society. And the thing is, you don't get many opportunities, so we've got to make sure we don't make any of these mistakes again. I mean, as the Russians did, Lenin really understood the need for terror because he was a bit late off the mark. Even the Bolsheviks, they go on about the Red Terror. If you actually saw what happened to the workers that took over the Kremlin, and they sort of went in, and this is in 1917, and the garrison that defended it, they said, well, now we've taken over, this is the workers, off you go. And they came back the next day and slit all their throats, And so every time these things happen, we've got to make sure they don't happen again. We've got to learn from these lessons. We have to concentrate our strength. And we've also got to remember, and we have to be phenomenally bitter, because, this is our class they butchered, and they'll quite happily do it again, and we've got to be ready for them next time.
Does anyone in the room want to try and answer some of the questions that was given to the speaker? Or has anyone got any other questions they'd like to ask? Because if no one else has got nothing to say, I'll bring the speaker back to save us all sitting here in painful, embarrassed silence. This is your last chance. It's like being an auctioneer up here at the moment. Okay, I'm going to bring Talat back to sum up. Before I do, I just want to give an announcement for any comrades from Merseyside. There's a meeting for you in room 3E at 6 p.m. and I'm afraid I don't know where room 3E is, which building it's in, but it is in. It's in Ulu. And also, there's this meeting is part of a course called Cities and Revolutions, and the next meeting in this course is tonight at 7 o'clock. In room 101, and it's Red Vienna, 1934.
I'll start on the question of women first, because as one of the contributors pointed out, although women were obviously very, very central to the revolt in Paris and being leading communards and what have you, yes, it does appear as if there was a slight discrepancy, because although they had universal suffrage, the universal suffrage did not actually apply to women. But what I will say about this is that I think it's important and I'm not trying to make any excuses here at all. We are talking about the 19th century. I mean, it's very much a product of its time. And yes, it was contradictory. I mean, we can sit back here now and we recognize it fully as being completely contradictory. Here, on the one hand, you have a situation where, women are not allowed to participate in the elections or to stand as reps themselves and what have you, etc. And yet, on the other hand, you have the fantastic courage and heroism of people like Louise Michel, who, once she was captured, I've got a quotation of what she turned around and said to Thiers and the Versailles troops. She turned around and said, "I will not defend myself. I will not be defended. I belong entirely to the social revolution. If you let me live, I shall not cease to cry vengeance." Now, so on the one hand, you have a situation where women don't appear to have as much participation as men, but on the other hand, you have this fantastic heroism and women actually playing a leading role. And yes, it is a contradiction. And I think as those contradictions, they're not isolated. I think they're very much part and parcel of the contradictions that were at the heart of the different forces who were leading the commune at the time. The contradictions that somebody's already mentioned about how they actually set about trying to organise themselves in terms of these representatives. It was all based upon geographical localities. It wasn't based upon workplaces. Now, again, in one sense, it's the first time that you have a situation in world history where workers come to the point where they're actually taking power. We've always said in the Marxist tradition that we in the Socialist Workers' Party in 1997 can never offer a complete and total blueprint of what a socialist society would be like. It's virtually impossible, because the whole thing and the beauty of Marxist analysis of what he's writing is that Marx didn't dream up the idea of a socialist society. The reason he came up with the idea of how society should be and how humanity could be bettered is because of the social forces and the historical processes that he witnessed and that he studied from the past. When he wrote the Communist Manifesto, he had to actually make a change about the role of the state and the smashing of the state. Why did he make that change? Because he learned from the lessons of the Parisian masses that because they hadn't totally smashed the state, therefore, that was a mistake that they made. But he couldn't have foreseen that beforehand, and so therefore he made changes to his own actual writings, because it's only in the real life struggle as it unfolds of men and women together fighting to take control of their destinies that actually Marxists learn about what real socialism is. And so therefore, I'm not trying to make many excuses for the communards, but I think we have to put it into context. And also, of course, the key thing was a question of politics. I said before that in terms of the committees, there was only a tiny minority of the representatives, 20 of them, who were influenced by the International, who were influenced by the ideas of Marx and Engels. The overwhelming majority of them at that time were not. When the communists was crushed, because Marx was the only one that defended it, his defense of the commune led to a total split in the International. On the one hand, you had the formation of the British Labour Party and the German Social Democratic Party, who believed in the idea of parliamentarism and gradual change and what have you. And on the other hand, the split was towards Lenin and the Bolsheviks, which was that, as far as they were concerned, the lessons to be drawn from Paris 1871 was that you could not have halfway measures with the bourgeois rulers. You could not take over their system and use their instruments as our instruments for running society. It had to be completely destroyed. And so I think that those sorts of points are very important for us to remember. The question about the size of the population of Paris, I don't know the exact figures, but one of the bourgeois commentators has quoted that the population of Paris at that time was about 500,000. So, you think about 20 to 30,000 people being massacred, it is absolutely enormous. And even then, that is a conservative estimate. We will never know exactly what the numbers were. Somebody else asked a question about the strength of the working class, I think it was, about how big the working class was, in terms of workplaces and what have you, because obviously, today in Britain we talk about massive workplaces, like at Heathrow and British Airways and what have you. Of course, in 1871 you didn't have anything like that. What you did have was very small workplaces of maybe 20 or 30 people, artisans and workers, mostly based around food, garments, or those sorts of things. They're not the mass workplaces that we associate with capitalism today. And the actual population of Paris that was, if you like, working class was about 7.7% of the actual size of the population. But I think again, when you think about it in hindsight, if 7.7% of a population can actually achieve what they achieved. When I first read about the history of the Paris Commune, and I didn't know anything about it until I had to do this talk, but when you read about what they actually achieved, the sorts of things that I mentioned before, the sense of compassion that they had for ordinary people, the way that they wanted to have a bigger sense of open democracy. They are things that to this day, in July 1997, we still don't have, even though we have a so-called Labour government in power. We don't have open democracy. We don't have a situation where people should be paid exactly the same amount of wages, so that you don't have people that are into career politicians and what have you. We still have people like Jack Straw and even Frank Dobson talking about how they want to charge people for when they go and see their GPs and what have you. I mean, the actual advances that the Parisian masses made were absolutely incredible for the time that and the period that it actually occurred in. And again, I think that is something that is very important for us to remember. When people are telling their Paris stories, people are going on about there being a monument to tears. Even in Père Lachaise, it is absolutely obscene, but there is a plot for tears, which is absolutely disgusting. But fortunately, what is very good, it is just a tiny little plot somewhere. I tried finding it because I wanted to go and spit on it, but I couldn't find it anywhere at all. Unfortunately, even in Père Lachaise, the biggest pride of place is given over to the commemoration of the masses who were killed during that bloodbath. Then I'll just finish by saying, reiterating what I've said before. I think that the history of Paris 1817, the history of the Commune, is our history. It is something that we are proud of, and we stand on the shoulders of those people who fought back and gave their lives, as courageous as they were, but tragically mistakes were made. We fortunately have the benefit of hindsight and have the benefit of history, and to draw the lessons from their experience. And so therefore we owe it not just to ourselves, but we also owe it to the likes of people like Louise Michel and the tens of thousands who died and fought courageously in the Paris Commune, to make sure that those mistakes are not repeated again, and that we take up the banner where they left off.